In 1944, the German army believed it had already mastered modern warfare. The Wehrmacht had rewritten military doctrine in Europe, crushed experienced armies, and proven that speed, coordination, and discipline could decide wars in weeks rather than years. German officers did not see themselves as amateurs or improvisers. They saw themselves as professionals, men who understood war at its most technical and demanding level. So when American forces began arriving in large numbers in Western Europe, German commanders were confident they knew exactly what to expect. What they did not expect was to be fundamentally confused, because the Americans did not fight the way Germany believed an army should fight. At first, German commanders assumed American coordination was an illusion. They believed the United States relied on overwhelming resources rather than skill, that once pressure was applied, American units would fragment into isolated elements. In German doctrine, coordination was centralized, tightly controlled from above, and dangerously vulnerable when communications were disrupted. They expected American forces, drawn from civilian life only months before, to struggle under fire, to hesitate, to lose cohesion when plans began to fail. But that is not what happened. From Normandy onward, German units began reporting something they could not fully explain. American infantry advances were never truly alone. Artillery fire adjusted rapidly, often faster than German commanders believed possible. Armor appeared in support not by coincidence, but by design. And most unsettling of all, American air power seemed to respond directly to the battlefield itself, arriving not on rigid schedules, but in coordination with ground forces who were actively fighting. To German officers trained in rigid command structures, this behavior made little sense. They disrupted American communications, expecting paralysis. Instead, American units continued operating. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers made decisions without waiting for distant approval. Requests for fire support moved quickly through a system that trusted initiative rather than punished it. German after-action reports began noting that American forces reacted faster than expected, even when under heavy pressure, even when conditions were chaotic. What German commanders struggled to accept was that this coordination was not accidental, and it was not improvised in Europe. It had been designed years earlier, far from front lines, in classrooms, training grounds, and war games that assumed chaos rather than perfection. American planners did not ask how units should behave when everything worked. They asked how they should behave when everything failed. This distinction mattered. German doctrine had been built around excellence under ideal conditions. Clear lines of command, precise orders, highly trained officers expected to interpret intent correctly and enforce discipline rigidly. This system had worked brilliantly in the early years of the war, when momentum was high and communications were intact. But by 1944, the battlefield no longer rewarded rigidity. American doctrine assumed confusion from the beginning. In training, American units were deliberately exposed to broken communications, changing objectives, and unexpected resistance. Officers were evaluated not on how well they followed plans, but on how effectively they adapted when plans collapsed. Non-commissioned officers were given authority to act independently, not as an exception, but as a requirement. This cultural difference was invisible at first, but devastating in practice. German intelligence officers began collecting reports that did not align with their expectations. They noted that American attacks often appeared uncoordinated at the surface level. Units advanced at uneven speeds. Movements lacked the visual precision Germans associated with discipline. Yet, despite this apparent disorder, American forces consistently achieved their objectives. When German counterattacks were launched, they encountered prepared defenses. When breakthroughs seemed possible, artillery fire arrived with uncanny speed. To German eyes, this was deeply unsettling. They were trained to read the battlefield through structure and hierarchy. They searched for command posts, for centralized control nodes to destroy. What they encountered instead was a system that functioned without revealing its internal logic. American coordination did not depend on a single point of failure. It was distributed. It was resilient. When one element was disrupted, another adapted. When plans changed, the system absorbed the shock instead of collapsing. This confusion intensified as the campaign progressed. During the breakout from Normandy, German units attempted to exploit what they believed were coordination failures. They identified American spearheads and assumed they could be isolated. In previous campaigns, such isolation would have crippled an advance. Instead, American spearheads continued moving forward, supported by artillery units miles away and air power that responded to requests in near real time. German commanders reported feeling as though they were fighting an enemy who reacted faster than information could travel. This perception was not entirely wrong. American forward observers operated close to the front, often embedded directly with infantry units. These observers did not wait for layered approval. They communicated directly with artillery batteries and air controllers, translating battlefield conditions into immediate action. The Germans, accustomed to slower, more centralized processes, underestimated how quickly American firepower could be brought to bear. The psychological effect was profound. German officers described a constant sense of pressure. Even when American units appeared to pause, German forces hesitated to move. They feared that any concentration of troops would draw instant artillery or air attack. This eroded initiative. Decisions that once would have been made confidently were delayed or abandoned altogether. Coordination, in this sense, became a weapon. Captured German soldiers often expressed the same confusion. They described American units as always supported, always connected, even when the battlefield suggested otherwise. Some believed the Americans possessed superior intelligence sources. Others suspected that American movements were directed by unseen commanders watching everything at once. The reality was more unsettling than either explanation. American coordination was built to function under stress. Training emphasized adaptability rather than blind obedience. Doctrine encouraged initiative at lower levels. Communication existed not to control every action, but to enable rapid response. This allowed American forces to operate as a system rather than as isolated units, something German doctrine was no longer designed to counter effectively. This perception was reinforced by American logistics. German doctrine had never fully integrated logistics into tactical thinking. Supplies were expected to follow success, not enable it. American forces reversed this logic. Logistics were treated as a combat function. Fuel, ammunition, replacements, and maintenance were coordinated with operational planning, ensuring that momentum could be sustained. To German observers, this appeared almost unnatural. American units did not pause for long periods to reorganize. Losses were replaced quickly. Equipment failures were addressed systematically. What German commanders interpreted as endless reserves were, in reality, the result of coordination extending far beyond the front lines. By late 1944, German officers began to adjust their language. They stopped describing American forces as inexperienced. Instead, they spoke of them as unpredictable. This shift was subtle, but significant. It reflected a growing recognition that American coordination did not rely on brilliance at the top, but competence throughout the system. Over time, confusion turned into recognition. German commanders came to understand that they were not simply fighting American soldiers. They were fighting an industrial, organizational, and doctrinal system designed to scale, adapt, and continue operating despite losses. American coordination absorbed pressure without losing momentum. It adapted without requiring perfect information. It functioned not because everything went according to plan, but because it assumed plans would fail. This realization came far too late. The German army had mastered a form of warfare suited to speed and precision. The Americans had mastered one suited to endurance and adaptation. On a battlefield defined by uncertainty, the latter proved decisive. What German officers encountered in 1944 was not merely an opposing army, but a different philosophy of war, one that transformed coordination itself into a strategic advantage. And once that reality became clear, there was no longer any question of how the conflict would end. This moment, when a highly professional enemy was forced to confront the limits of its own assumptions, is preserved here in the American archive.